Okay. So for people on YouTube, Fridays are going to be now hybrid, so Fridays will be online. Okay. So we're on the last part of shoulder joint. We just have to get through a few of the muscles. Once we finish the muscles, that's it. That's all the material for your next exam. So this is all you have. So you need to make sure you go back and watch that shoulder girdle video, actually study, because some people I think didn't study and then didn't do very well on the test because they thought they'd be able to look everything up and they weren't fast enough. So that will be very similar. I do have some Jeopardies I can post that you guys can play on your own, but again, I'm not going to play those in class because participation was bad. Okay. So for muscles, we're going to start out with our deltoid. So our deltoid is going to be probably one of the muscles you actually know. This is kind of your shoulder cap. Sits right over the kind of end of your scapula, your clavicle, and it gives your shoulder that shape. So people who have very rounded big shoulders have really big deltoid muscles, or you probably heard delts. So your deltoids have 3 parts. So that's what that A, M, and P is. You have an anterior portion, you have a middle portion, and you have a posterior portion. So we can see anterior, middle, posterior. So our anterior portion is going to originate on anterolateral. So that's what anterolateral basically means, the front and the outside of the clavicle, so this outer end. The middle portion is going to come off lateral acromion process, which we know this is our acromion process, so it's coming right off the side. And our posterior is going to come off of the inferior edge of the spine of the scapula. So we've got our spine of our scapula right here, so the inferior edge is this bottom aspect of it. So you can see that deltoid is basically making a nice wrap all the way around that shoulder. So its insertion is very easy. It should be very easy to recognize because it says its name in the definition. So the deltoid inserts on that deltoid tuberosity, which we know was that bump on the lateral side of the shaft of our humerus. Now, because we have 3 regions, each of the regions do different actions. So the anterior portion, and basically all of them, anterior, medial, or middle, and posterior, are all going to do abduction. So they're all going to do arms up, which is probably why if you've ever done any work in the gym for your delts, you probably were doing lateral delt raises or kind of flies, which is just abduction. But they have different actions. So anterior is going to do abduction. It's also going to do flexion, so bringing forward. It's going to do horizontal adduction, so bringing your arm in. And it's going to do internal rotation. Now middle is easy because it's just abduction. And posterior, besides abduction, it's just the reverse of anterior. So they're all abduction, but you can see anterior is going to be flexion, horizontal AD, and internal, while posterior is going to be extension, horizontal AB, and external. So the anterior and posterior, besides abduction, are just reverses of each other. So it's doing arm back, arm out, external rotation. Okay. So next one is our pectoralis major. So this is another muscle you've probably heard of, so your pecs, but you probably don't know actually how big it is. So your pec major is very large, and it's made up of 2 portions. So it can be called your clavicular portion and your sternal portion, or how I have it written, your upper portion and your lower portion. So that upper portion would be the clavicular portion, while the lower portion would be the sternal portion. So upper is going to be the medial half of the anterior surface of the clavicle. So again, all that means, divide the clavicle in half. It's going to be the front of the inside. So this inner portion is going to be the origination of the upper portion, obviously clavicular because it makes sense. The lower portion is going to be on the anterior surfaces of all of the costal cartilages of the first 6 ribs. So we know that those costal cartilages are the connection between the rib to the sternum. So the first 6, so you can just count down. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the sternum. So you can see it's coming along the edge of the clavicle, following down, basically going down the entire sternum, but it stops at the xiphoid process. So it follows that edge all the way down, does not continue on to the point, so it just ends right before it. Okay, it's going to insert into that intertubicular groove on the humerus, which we know is that space in between that greater tubercle and that lesser tubercle. We had that shallow groove running right in between. So it's going to be coming across and attaching on into that groove. So they both have different actions, which can be a little confusing. So the upper portion does flexion up to 60 degrees. So if we know that this is 90, it's going to be about here. So it's coming just the first 60 degrees. The lower portion will be doing extension to the first 60 degrees. So again, it will be going this portion. Both of them together do adduction, so bringing your arm in, internal rotation, and horizontal adduction. Now the horizontal adduction is what you're going to see in a bench press, right? So you'd be bench pressing, you'd be coming horizontal abducting, you'd be coming out, then you'd be horizontal adducting when you come in. So bench press is really just doing one aspect of what the pecs actually do. Okay. So next muscle is another muscle you've probably heard of if you work out. Your latissimus dorsi. Now this is your lats. So, and again, your lats are way larger than people think they are. They're almost a back muscle, honestly, besides a shoulder muscle. So the origin, you can see how large this lat muscle is and how much it's going on the spine. So the origin is going to be posterior crest of the ilium, which if we go way back to the hip, we know this was our iliac crest, posterior, so right at the edge or here, that kind of sticks out, posterior crest of the ilium. On the back of the sacrum, so posterior sacrum, just a little bit, it's going to do the spinous processes, so all of the points of all the lumbar vertebra, so L1 through L5, and then it's going to do T6 to T12. So it's coming all the way up to T6, which is about here, and it's also going to attach on our last 3 ribs. So much bigger than you think it is, right? It is going to insert in the same spot as the pectoralis major, that intertubicular groove. But what the latissimus dorsi does, intertubicular groove is anterior, its origination is posterior. So it's going to come up in your armpit, it's going to travel anteriorly and then insert. So it's going to travel across and insert anterior while the most of it is posterior. So it is going to do adduction, extension, internal rotation, and horizontal abduction. Now, what exercise do you normally do in the gym for your lats? Anyone know? Lat pull downs or pull ups, right? Which that is really just getting that adduction. It's only targeting adduction. So there's quite a lot of other things that could be done. If you've ever done in maybe rehab, have anyone done, they're called swimmers, where you have your arm behind your back and you do that? It's a little rehab exercise, but that's hitting your lats because we're doing adduction, extension, internal rotation, and horizontal AB. Okay, so now we are moving on to more scapula muscles. So we have our teres major. So teres major is going to originate on the scapula. So it's going to be on the lateral border of the scapula, so the outside edge, just superior to the inferior angle. So again, if you haven't watched shoulder girdle, you need to watch that. So inferior angle is that point at the bottom of the scapula. So lateral border is going to be this whole edge. So just superior to that inferior angle, find the inferior angle, just a little bit up. It's going to be on that edge. It is going to wrap around, traveling from posterior, wrapping anterior, into that intertrabecular groove again. So wrapping into the front. It's going to do extension, internal rotation, and adduction. So it actually kind of, if you were going to target, or if I tested the teres major, how to test it for strength, I would go like this, and then have the person push up against my arm. If I put my hand on their elbow, they'd be pushing up. That's kind of the exact motion of the teres major. Okay. Now this is a muscle you've probably never heard of. Your coracobrachialis. So just by looking at its name, and if you watch shoulder girdle, you'll know that coraco is going to be referring to that coracoid process, which is that finger-like projection that goes anterior from the scapula. So the origin is going to be the coracoid process of the scapula. Brachialis is always referring to the anterior humerus. So that's kind of the brachium is a general word, usually anterior humerus. So it is going to insert onto the middle of the humeral shaft on the medial border. So halfway down the humerus, medial border, so inner edge, and that's where it's going to insert. So it's going to be traveling from here to there. Your coracoid process is usually very sensitive and tender. So if you put your hands on your shoulders, like the rounded part, and if you slide in a touch and push in, that's your coracoid, and it's usually quite sensitive. So that's usually the easiest way for me to find it. I slide in from the person's shoulder, and I just push, and if it hurts, I know I found it. So the action is going to be flexion, because we know that anterior shoulder muscles are going to be shoulder flexors, adduction, and horizontal adduction. So everything, bringing it in. Okay. These next ones are very easy to memorize because their origin is basically their name. So now we are in the subscapularis. So our subscapularis is going to originate off of that subscapular fossa, which we know is that whole inner portion of the scapula that's touching the rib cage. So you can see it is on that inner subscapular fossa. Rib cage is pushed up against it. It is going to insert onto that lesser tubercle of the humerus, so the bump on the anterior side. It is going to do internal rotation, adduction, and extension. So sometimes with the subscapularis, there is a test called the subscapular liftoff, and you have the person's hand right here, and you have them take their hand and move it off their back, which is actually much harder than you think it is. But if you have a good subscapularis, you should be able to do that motion. If you don't, you'll have a very hard time. So next one, which we're also now into the rotator cuff muscles. All of these are rotator cuffs. So the supraspinatus, super simple because origin is the supraspinous fossa. So supraspinous, above the spine of the scapula. So this whole region right here, it's going to insert onto the greater tubercle of the humerus. So what it does is it sits on that supraspinous fossa. It's going to travel underneath that clavicle and the acromion process. There's that small space. It's going to pop out from underneath there and then go down to that greater tubercle over here. So it kind of gets pinched through this area. So a lot of times if you have clavicle or acromion issues, some people will have hooked clavicles. They'll have extra bone. They can cause damage to that supraspinatus. So the action is going to be abduction. There's another fun test for the supraspinatus called the empty can. And you have them go into a position that's called scaption, which is basically 30 degrees of horizontal adduction. And you have them put their hands down. And you'd have them resist. And you'll see people will have very weak ones. It's just a special test for the supraspinatus. Next one. If we know there's a supraspinatus, we're going to have an infraspinatus. So infraspinatus, below the spine of the scapula. So this whole region below. Origin is going to be the infraspinous fossa. The insertion is going to also be that greater tubercle of the humerus. So it just has to wrap around posteriorly to that greater tubercle. It is going to do external rotation, horizontal abduction, and extension. So we've got one more of our rotator cuff. So our rotator cuff muscles, you can memorize them by the SITS acronym, S-I-T-S. So supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, subscapularis. So all those four are the rotator cuff. So we had a teres major, we're going to have a teres minor. So typically if something has the name major in it, there's going to be a minor. So pectoralis major also has a minor. So the origin of the teres minor is going to be the upper and middle portion of the lateral border. So that lateral border again is that edge of the scapula. So upper and middle portion will just be this region. It's going to insert onto that greater tubercle again. So you can see most of your rotator cuff muscles all insert onto that greater tubercle. It's going to do external rotation, horizontal abduction, and extension, which you notice is the same as the infraspinatus. So the infraspinatus and the teres minor work together. So that's why infraspinatus is pictured right here. Teres minor is kind of just below it. So they work together, do the same actions. Okay, that's it. You made it through. So that is it for all of the muscles. So basically, what I probably will do is I will post the Jeopardies for Monday. There will be, I think there is an exam Jeopardy. I will come to class on Monday to play exam Jeopardy if people want to come. Maybe I'll try to convert it to a Kahoot or something to make it more fun for me. And then your test will open on Wednesday. So you will not come to class on Wednesday, but that will be the 31st, right? So you will have class, or not class, you'll have a test on the 31st. And it'll be the same thing as we did last time. It will be on Canvas. It will open at 9:05. will close at 11:59. There's a reason why you can't take it now. You need to tell me 48 hours before. If something comes up during the day that you can't take it, then you need to contact me that moment. Don't contact me 2 or 3 days afterwards, because I'm not going to give you the chance to extension. Okay.